A teleprinter chatters in a dim room, paper curling as it spits out a report that smells of warm ink and cigarette smoke. A German duty officer reads it once, then again, slower the second time, because the message is exactly what he has been waiting for since dawn on June 6th. The enemy has landed, yes, but the real blow is still coming somewhere else. Outside, aircraft engines rumble and phone lines stay hot. Inside, one decision is about to freeze an entire army in place. This is not a story about one brilliant lie. It is about an engineered deception system built like a production line that manufactured believable truth on a schedule. By the end, you'll understand how a fake spy network, disciplined message timing, and ruthless quality control helped keep Hitler's reserves waiting after D-Day, and why the most dangerous weapon in that operation was credibility, measured in minutes. Exhibit A is the channel. A spy message is worthless if it arrives too fast, too clean, or too conveniently. Real espionage has friction, missed radio windows, poor reception, routine delays, and human doubt. The Allied deception around the Pas de Calais, often grouped under Fortitude, didn't fight that friction. It simulated it. The goal wasn't volume. The goal was cadence. Exhibit B is the agent the Germans trusted most. Garbo, a Spanish volunteer turned double agent under British control. Reports describe him as a man who sold the Germans an entire network of sub-agents and observers, most of them fictional. That sounds like theater. Operationally, it was a data structure. Each imaginary node could see something in one place and time. Each could be late sometimes, wrong sometimes, confident sometimes, and cautious when it mattered. That mix is what makes a fabricated stream feel like reality. Now anchor it to a real slice of work. Britain, early summer 1944, in an office where maps and files matter more than guns. A handler checks Garbo's reporting history, checks what the Germans are asking for, and shapes the next message like a technician tuning an instrument. Too precise and it smells staged. Too vague and it loses value. Too consistent and it looks manufactured. So the message carries just enough mess, partial detail, cautious phrasing, and the kind of confidence that sounds borrowed from a friend who knows a friend. Then the message moves through a chain that has its own bottlenecks. A transmission window opens. Radio traffic is sent. Intermediaries relay it. German receivers log it, decode it, and pass it up a hierarchy that is always short on time. Deception isn't only what you say, it's what the other side can process before their next decision deadline. Here is what people get wrong when they think Fortitude was mainly inflatable tanks. Decoys mattered, but decoys were the picture. The deception that held reserves was the paperwork, the steady accumulation of reports that trained German decision-makers to expect the main landing at Calais. When Normandy happened, the question inside German headquarters wasn't, did the Allies land? It was, is this the main effort or the diversion we were warned about? Fortitude's job was to keep the second question louder than the first. That mattered because moving reserves is mechanical reality, not rhetoric. A panzer formation doesn't teleport. It needs rail slots or road columns, fuel allocation, bridge capacity, maintenance pauses, and permission. Every hour spent moving the wrong way is an hour you can't undo. If you send reserves toward Normandy and the main invasion hits Calais, you've created the catastrophe you were trying to prevent. So uncertainty makes leaders conservative, and deception weaponizes that conservatism. Fortitude exploited timing like an engineer exploits tolerances. Before D-Day, The deception teaches a pattern. The decisive landing will come in the Pas de Calais with signatures that should appear beforehand. That pattern becomes a template. On D-Day, when Normandy erupts, the template doesn't shatter, it flexes. This can be the first blow, it whispers, but the real one is still pending. Exhibit C is the counterintuitive rule that makes the whole machine believable. Sometimes you must warn your enemy in order to trap him. Accounts describe Garbo sending an urgent warning about Normandy, but timed so it arrived too late to stop the landings. That sounds like failure until you see the mechanism. A warning that is late still buys credibility. It proves the agent was trying. It keeps the channel alive. And once the channel is alive, it can deliver the next more valuable push. Hold your best forces back for the second strike. That is quality control in deception form. If an agent never misses, he's suspicious. If he misses once in a way that can be explained, bad reception, delayed relay, a nervous courier, he becomes believable. Believability is the capacity to influence tomorrow's decision, not the capacity to win today's moment. Now look at the German side of the desk. A staff officer in northern France, overloaded with reports, triages what deserves escalation. He sees Calais as the logical crossing, shorter distance, better ports, familiar risk. He has agent reports that insist a larger force is still assembling. He has pressure from above. Don't be the man who strips Calais and hands the enemy a straight road inland. In that environment, wait feels like prudence. Waiting pins formations in place. It preserves fuel and rail capacity. It keeps command dignity intact. Deception doesn't force you to do something foolish. It invites you to do something reasonable that happens to be fatal. So the messages after D-Day mattered more than the messages before it. The phantom invasion had to stay alive in German minds during the exact window when reserve movement could still change Normandy's outcome. That window is built out of hours. How fast reconnaissance arrives, how long orders take to propagate, how long columns take to move under air attack, and how hard it is to reverse a mistake. And the whole machine had one fragile dependency. After the beaches are already burning in Normandy, how do you keep the Germans believing in Calais when their own reconnaissance begins reporting the truth? Unless the deception can survive contact with reality itself? Because the order was still to wait. Even as Normandy filled the horizon with smoke and real evidence began grinding through the German information system. Fortitude's hardest moment came after D-Day, when reality arrived faster than any handler could choreograph. Aerial photographs showed beaches crowded with ships. Prisoner reports produced unit identifiers. Rail lines south of Paris carried emergency movements. If the deception was just scenery, it would have cracked under that load. Instead, it did something tougher. It accepted Normandy as a fact, then used that fact to protect the conclusion that mattered. Normandy could still be the opening move, not the final act. Exhibit D is the credibility buffer, how a deception stays intact when truth pushes back. You don't survive heat by denying it. You survive by managing load and keeping the output stable through the decision window. Garbo's reporting stream did not deny that an invasion had happened. It framed the invasion as exactly what a diversion would look like if the Allies wanted Germany to spend armor, air power, and time in the wrong place. Now anchor it. Mid-June 1944, a German headquarters in northern France. A coastal map is pinned to the wall. Phones ring in short, urgent bursts. An officer reads a reconnaissance summary with Normandy circled in pencil. then flips to agent traffic coming in through channels that treat stamped paper as command. The inputs do not align cleanly. Normandy is bleeding. Calais is quiet. Quiet in a system trained to expect surprise feels like the loudest warning of all. Here is the engineering advantage Fortitude exploited. Institutional inertia. One brilliant message can be dismissed as agent talk. A long-running network with consistent internal logic is harder to dismiss because rejecting it means admitting you were wrong yesterday. Fortitude fed that inertia with staff-sounding reasons for caution. Weather windows, shipping cycles, assembly time for follow-on echelons, and the constraint that the decisive crossing would want the shortest route, the tightest air cover, and the simplest reinforcement path. Exhibit E is the phantom order of battle. Fortitude's strongest output wasn't a decoy tank. It was a believable inventory. Formations that appeared to exist, had training areas, and produced routine noise through control channels. German analysts didn't need every badge and battalion to be perfect. They needed to believe that a large American-led formation in southeast England remained intact and uncommitted. That single belief made "keep the 15th Army in place" feel like prudence, not paralysis. How do you make a fake army feel real to an enemy staff? You give it routine. Routine is what real armies generate: requests, delays, movement rumors, and small mistakes. Some routine came from staged activity, but the critical layer was reporting discipline. Enough consistent activity to keep analysts from closing the file. The output did not have to be flawless. It had to be persistent. But persistence has a cost. Every extra detail is a surface where you can be caught. So deception becomes a balancing act between richness and risk. Garbo's network solved that by distributing detail across multiple fictional subagents, each responsible for a narrow slice. One subagent reports increased vehicle movement near a rail line. Another reports amphibious training gossip. Another reports a careless remark in a public place. No single report proves anything. Together, they create the sense of a living formation with tempo, friction, and believable noise. This matters because the German system was built to aggregate weak signals. In war, most information is partial, late, and biased. A pile of small, plausible inputs can outweigh one dramatic truth, especially if that truth forces an immediate, frightening decision. Normandy looked like truth. Calais still looked like the nightmare, because it was the shortest crossing and the one Germany had prepared to fear. Exhibit F is delay as a weapon. After D-Day, every day the 15th Army stayed in place protected the Calais sector. That day also denied reinforcement to Normandy. Fortitude didn't need Hitler to believe forever. It only needed him to believe through the window when a concentrated response might still have mattered. The goal wasn't to create ignorance. It was to create a reason to wait. One more day, then one more. So Fortitude aimed at the levers that mattered: when to release reserves, when to shift rail priorities, when to accept that the main effort was already underway. The deception pushed those levers by keeping the second landing expectation alive. And the most fragile moment wasn't a speech in Berlin. It was a staff officer staring at contradictory inputs, choosing which one would become tomorrow's baseline order. Watch that choice in a tight slice. A German analyst reads a new note: more landing craft, more dumps, more vehicles beyond the beaches. He can interpret that as proof Normandy is the main invasion, or as proof the Allies are building a base for something larger. If he treats Normandy as the main invasion and pulls forces from Calais, he risks being blamed for opening the shortest door. If he treats Normandy as the first act of a two-act plan, he can justify caution. Fortitude made caution feel like competence. The British weren't guessing at this psychology in the dark. They watched feedback. If German reactions could be inferred from deployments and the stubborn pattern of where forces refused to move, handlers could tune the next messages. Not perfect knowledge, operational reality never offers that, but enough to keep the story from colliding with the enemy's habits. And still, reality kept pushing. Normandy didn't fade. The beachhead expanded. Heavy equipment landed. Supplies arrived in volume. That created a German question that threatened the whole structure. If the Allies can feed an army without a captured port, how long can a diversion keep growing before it becomes the war? A skeptical enemy can still be delayed. A provoked enemy can demand proof. By late June, one demand began forming like a hard knot in the pipeline. Actionable, time-specific detail, something that would force the network to either deliver a verifiable warning or expose itself as a machine that only manufactures atmosphere. That is the decision point the next exhibit must face. And the way it faced it was not by adding more theater, but by paying for credibility with something the Germans could time. Because the moment an analyst asks for a date, a location, and a reason, your deception stops being a story and becomes a system that can be tested. Fortitude survived that moment by doing something that feels backward. It let its star agent be late on purpose, then used that lateness as proof he was real. Exhibit G is the timed message, not the content alone, but the timestamp, when it was sent, when it arrived, and what that implied about the network's plumbing. A fake source can write perfect prose. A real source produces friction, missed trains, delayed couriers, nervous pauses, and reports that arrive just after the event. Now anchor it. Early June 1944. London, inside a small room. A wireless set sits on a table like a metal animal, warm to the touch. A handler watches a clock because clocks are the only things spies truly fear. If Garbo reports too early and too precisely, he becomes an oracle. If he reports too late and too vaguely, he becomes useless. The safe lane is narrow, shaped by radio schedules, encoding time, and the physical fact that messages have distance. So the report is engineered like a component. First, a plausible acquisition. A subagent hears of movement, but not with certainty. Second, a plausible transmission. The message is sent when it could realistically be sent, not when it would be most convenient for history. Third, a plausible delay. The Germans receive it after the landings are already underway, which lets them believe two things at once. Garbo tried, and wartime friction slowed him. What people get wrong is thinking credibility is only accuracy. In espionage, credibility is often the shape of your mistakes. Fortitude understood that Germany's internal model of the world included bureaucracy, censorship, and broken communications. A report that arrived cleanly ahead of D-Day would have looked unnatural. A report that arrived shortly after, with frustration and incomplete detail, looked like a real network straining under pressure. But the time message did more than protect Garbo. It created a lever inside German decision-making. It implied access, enough access to justify keeping the Calais file open. And it implied limitation, enough limitation to excuse why that access didn't produce a perfect tactical warning. That combination is poison to a staff trying to make a binary choice. It tells them why waiting can be defended. Exhibit H is the second act story, delivered as logistics, not drama. The deception had to explain why Normandy kept growing without conceding that Normandy was the main effort. The answer was supply. A real invasion is not a line on a map. It is fuel, ammunition, rations, bridging gear, replacement vehicles, and the slow weight of tonnage that turns a beachhead into an army. Fortitude suggested the Allies could feed a limited force in Normandy while preparing the decisive blow across the shortest water. That framing fit German fear. Calais wasn't just geography. It was an obsession built into defenses, staff plans, and the belief that the enemy would choose the most efficient crossing. Fortitude didn't fight that obsession head-on. It used it as a rail that German reasoning could slide along, even while Normandy burned. Now put the pressure back on the pipeline. If the Germans demanded actionable detail, the network had to provide it without offering a single checkable piece that would force collapse. So handlers leaned on soft specifics, intent language that sounded like staff talk, unit types that could be misread, and training areas described loosely enough to be plausible, but hard to falsify. The danger wasn't only German verification, it was internal consistency. Every message had to match the broader traffic picture, other controlled agents, staged radio nets, and the physical noise of preparations in England. If one thread contradicted another, an analyst could finally justify cutting the cord. This is where Fortitude becomes engineering again. The deception wasn't held together by one genius. It was held together by synchronization. Multiple channels had to output a coherent signal without being identical. Too identical, and it looks scripted. Too different, and it looks chaotic. The only way to do that at scale is process, agreed themes, disciplined vocabulary, and tight control over what each source could know. Picture the control room side in one slice, a table covered in paper. A handler with a pencil rewrites a phrase not for beauty, but for risk. Heavy units is safer than armored division. Southeast is safer than a town name. The aim is to keep the German analyst leaning forward without giving him a handle. Meanwhile, on the German side, the same caution becomes a trap. If Garbo is credible but limited, then every gap in his reporting can be explained as friction rather than deception. And if Calais is the expected main blow, then every quiet day there becomes evidence of patience rather than absence. Fortitude didn't need Germans to be foolish. It needed them to be defensible. But defensible decisions still require triggers. At some point, commanders would have to either release reserves toward Normandy or accept the risk of a second landing. Fortitude tried to keep that trigger from firing by feeding uncertainty into the seam where doctrine demanded caution, committing armored reserves. So the deception tightened around one operational question. Not is Normandy real, but is Normandy the whole thing? That is a more dangerous question because it can be answered incorrectly for weeks while still sounding rational. It is also the question that buys time, and time is the only resource Fortitude could spend. It could not permanently freeze German movement. It could only slow it through the critical days when Allied forces were vulnerable and supply lines were thin. Which brings us to the next decision point. When the evidence pile finally outweighed the Calais fear, what did Fortitude leave behind? An excuse to wait or a reason to move? And that file bundle, kept fat on purpose, is where the deception finally has to do its hardest job. Survive the moment when reality becomes louder than any report. Exhibit 1 is the reserve decision itself. How you delay armored movement without looking like you are delaying it. German commanders were not choosing between truth and fantasy. They were choosing between two risks: commit reserves to Normandy and possibly uncover the real main blow at Calais, or hold reserves at Calais and risk Normandy becoming irreversible. Fortitude aimed straight at that seam because that seam is where waiting feels rational. Now anchor it. Mid-June 1944, northern France. Inside, an officer runs a finger down a map edge while another talks about fuel, roads, and air attack. The ground truth is ugly. Moving panzer formations in daylight is expensive when Allied fighter bombers patrol, bridges are damaged, rail lines are cut, and every column becomes a target. So any argument for waiting gains power if it sounds like prudence, not paralysis. This is where the deception's engineering logic becomes visible. Fortitude did not need the Germans to believe in a single cinematic lie. It needed them to keep their decision framework intact. That framework valued the shortest crossing, the threat of a second landing, and the danger of committing too early. Garbo's network fed that framework, not with new fantasies, but with confirmations that matched what Germany already feared. What people get wrong is assuming the Germans held back only because they were fooled. They also held back because moving reserves was genuinely hazardous and slow. Fortitude didn't invent those constraints. It used them. It made do nothing feel like the only choice that didn't obviously court disaster. Exhibit J is the cost of movement, the way Allied air power and logistics friction turned every kilometer into a bill. When reserves did move, they moved under pressure. Night marches, scattered routes, camouflage discipline, and delays that stacked like dominoes. Even a perfectly informed staff would still struggle to bring mass to Normandy quickly. Fortitude's value was in keeping that struggle from becoming a rush during the vulnerable early days. So the deception leaned on two forces at once. First, the fear of Calais. Second, the practical pain of moving. Together they created a trap. If you move and Calais happens, you're blamed forever. If you wait and Normandy grows, you can argue you were constrained by air attack and imperfect intelligence. Fortitude made one option shameful and the other defensible. But a deception cannot live on defense alone. It needs moments of apparent usefulness, little wins that make the analyst feel his file is paying rent. That's why controlled agents sometimes offer details that were true but not decisive. Traffic patterns, rumors, training chatter, unit types without dates. They were enough to keep the file alive, but never enough to let the Germans close the case. Now shift the camera to the German side, because the mechanism depends on their procedures. An intelligence officer does not only read one agent, he compares streams. He looks for consistency across different sources, intercepted signals, aerial reconnaissance, and reports from coastal watchers. Fortitude tried to occupy that comparison process by ensuring that at least some indicators pointed toward Calais preparations. Dummy activity, staged radio networks, and agent reports that agreed on the direction of threat. And yet Normandy keeps getting heavier. Supplies arrive, airfields appear, bridges go down, German units engage, and the fight produces its own evidence. At a certain point, a staff has to accept the uncomfortable. This is not a raid. This is a campaign. So how does Fortitude survive that acceptance? By changing what main effort means in the German mind. The story becomes, Normandy is serious, but it may be a fixing operation, an operation designed to pull reserves west, while the real crossing still threatens the Pas de Calais. That framing is not insane. It matches historical patterns. It matches the geography of the shortest crossing, and it matches the old staff fear that the enemy will exploit your first reaction. This is the crucial piece. Fortitude did not ask the Germans to ignore Normandy. It asked them to treat Normandy as incomplete. That keeps reserves near Calais without requiring anyone to deny what is happening in front of them. Now anchor the human pressure. A German commander hears reports from Normandy. Tank losses, artillery fire, villages taken and retaken. He wants reinforcements. He needs them. But he also receives instructions and warnings about the Calais threat, and those warnings carry institutional weight. If he strips Calais and the second landing appears, he will be blamed for opening the gate. Fortitude is not whispering in his ear like a ghost. It is sitting on his desk as a file that makes caution look like duty. Meanwhile, the deception's own weakness grows. Every day after D-Day, the lie becomes harder to sustain because the simplest verification method is time. If Calais is the main blow, it must arrive. If it does not arrive, the file becomes an embarrassment. Fortitude's last job is to delay the embarrassment just long enough for Allied ground reality to become irreversible. That's why the messages and themes in this phase must feel like they are approaching a climax without delivering it. They keep hinting at still coming, still assembling, still delayed, because delay is plausible when you imagine an army needing weather windows, shipping cycles, and port capacity. The deception uses the language of constraints because constraints are always believable. But here is the point where the courtroom logic becomes a single sentence you can test. If the Germans kept the Calais reserve locked, Normandy would buy itself time to turn into a portless, road-bound supply miracle. If the Germans released the reserve early, Normandy might be strangled before it could breathe. So the deception did not win by making Germans blind. It won by making Germans late. And now the last exhibit must answer the only question that matters. When the waiting finally broke, what did Fortitude leave in the German mind? Proof of a second landing, or proof that they had been engineered into delay? Or proof that they had been engineered into delay? And that question only becomes answerable when the German decision finally breaks in the real world. Because there was a breaking point, not a single dramatic confession, but a slow, grinding shift where files stopped feeling predictive and started feeling like insurance policies. Kept around because throwing them away felt risky, even when the premium was bleeding you. Exhibit K is the credibility collapse, and it doesn't look like a man slamming a folder shut. It looks like staff officers changing what they say out loud. The language moves from main landing to possible second landing, then to remaining threat, then finally to cover the coast while we deal with Normandy. In other words, the lie doesn't die. It gets demoted. That demotion is the win Fortitude was built to buy. Now anchor it. Late June into early July 1944, a German headquarters in France where the air smells like hot paper and stale smoke. Reports from Normandy are no longer tactical blips. They are weight, bridges down, roads cratered, convoys disrupted, artillery consuming shells faster than trains can deliver. Officers don't argue whether the invasion is real. They argue whether it is already too big to crush quickly and whether the reserves held near Calais can still arrive as a single fist or only as drips. Here is the uncomfortable mechanism. Every day you wait, the cost of moving rises because the Allies are building the world they need faster than you can dismantle it. Fortitude's success wasn't simply that the Germans hesitated. It's that the hesitation compounded with Allied air power and sabotage into a physical delay. And that's why the deception had to stay plausible just a little longer than common sense. It needed to keep the Calais theory alive long enough for Normandy to pass a threshold. Enough men, enough guns, enough fuel and ammunition coming ashore that a clean push into the sea was no longer a decision, it was a fantasy. Exhibit L is the release that still isn't a release. The way reserves can be committed in pieces while headquarters still tells itself it has not fully abandoned Calais. This is where a deception can keep paying even as reality punches through. If you move one formation and keep another back, you can claim you are balanced. You can claim you are not fooled. You can claim you are prudent. But war punishes partial measures when the other side has momentum. A German armored formation starts west under night cover, and the movement immediately collides with the constraints Fortitude always depended on. Allied aircraft prowling at dawn, broken rail hubs, fuel shortages, detours around bomb bridges, traffic jams of mixed units and refugees, and the constant fear that stopping equals death. A tank is fast on a clean road in a manual. In this reality, it is a machine trapped inside a hostile schedule. So the question becomes sharper than any agent report. Do you keep waiting for a second landing that never comes? Or do you accept that the second landing was the waiting itself? What people get wrong is imagining deception as a magic spell. Deception is a factory. It produces delays at scale by feeding the enemy's decision rules with inputs that feel responsible to act on. Garbo's reports did not need to be omnipotent. They needed to be timely, consistent, and safely confirmable, so that the German system would prefer caution over speed. Now look at the engineering of that factory one last time, because this is the part that makes Fortitude different from a myth. The deception had three practical virtues. First, redundancy. Garbo was not a lone voice. He was presented as a network, which meant the German file could survive small inconsistencies the way a machine survives vibration. One source can be wrong. A network can be noisy and still be treated as reliable. Second, latency control. The messages were designed so that when something happened, like D-Day, they could be framed as expected behavior inside a larger plan. That is how you keep a story alive after the world changes. You don't deny the world, you reclassify it. Third, costs align with reality. Fortitude leaned on the enemy's genuine constraints. Movement was dangerous, intelligence was incomplete, and Calais was geographically tempting. A lie that matches the shape of real constraints is harder to kill than a lie that requires the enemy to ignore his own experience. But there is still one final proof that matters. If Fortitude worked, it should show up not as a single intercepted admission, but as a time gap, a period where German reserves that could have moved earlier stayed oriented toward Calais, even as Normandy screamed for attention. And that is exactly where the story ends, because the outcome isn't a slogan, it's a timing consequence. Waiting kept forces out of the decisive early window, and once that window closed, the Allies no longer needed a perfect landing. They needed throughput. They needed to keep unloading men and materiel, keep expanding the lodgment, and keep turning German movement into exhaustion. So the verdict lines are not about tricking a dictator like a cartoon villain. They're about controlling a calendar. The most powerful weapon in Fortitude wasn't a fake tank. It was a believable reason to wait. And the most expensive mistake wasn't being wrong. It was being late, on the one day lateness could not be repaid. Thanks for watching. If you want more World War II stories told through real constraints and mechanisms, subscribe. Link is in the description.